There is a ring on the table, not thrown, not slammed down, placed, carefully, almost silently. And that difference matters, because in this reconstructed moment Princess Diana is not screaming. She is not creating the scene people would later expect from the woman newspapers repeatedly described as emotional, unpredictable, difficult. She is sitting almost perfectly still. Across from her are the two people whose relationship has occupied a space inside her marriage for years. Her husband, Prince Charles, and Camilla Parker Bowles. The room is quiet, too quiet. A lamp burns somewhere behind them. Glass catches the light. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, another royal evening continues as though nothing extraordinary is happening. But on the table sits the symbol that changes the entire room. Diana's ring. The public sees jewelry. Diana sees something else. A promise, a role, a marriage watched by millions, a future she had been asked to believe in when she was barely 20 years old, and now she has removed that symbol from her hand. No speech, no theatrical gesture, just the faint sound of metal touching polished wood. Charles looks at it, Camilla looks at Diana, and Diana does something neither of them expects. She does not ask whether she is imagining things, she does not ask for reassurance, she does not beg to be chosen, she simply looks across the table as though she has finally stopped asking permission to believe what she already knows. Then she speaks, and what happens next is not the end of Diana's marriage. Not yet. It is something more important. It is the beginning of Diana trusting her own perception. But before we go any further, one thing has to be made absolutely clear. There is no reliable historical record establishing that Diana literally removed a ring and placed it before Charles and Camilla in a three-way confrontation. That image is a dramatic reconstruction, a symbol of something that did happen. Because the real confrontation is powerful enough without invention. Diana described it herself. And once you hear what she said happened that night, the ring becomes almost unnecessary. Because she was already beginning to remove something far heavier, her silence. Rewind, go back to July 29, 1981, St. Paul's Cathedral. Lady Diana Spencer is 20 years old. Prince Charles is 32. The wedding is one of the defining television spectacles of its era. The dress, the carriage, the cathedral. The crowds, the mythology, to millions watching, it looks like the old fairy tale made flesh. A prince, a beautiful young bride, a palace waiting somewhere beyond the cameras. Diana becomes Princess of Wales. The official royal record confirms the wedding took place at St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981. William would be born in June 1982 and Harry in September 1984. The royal family, those are the clean facts, but marriages are not lived in official biographies, they are lived in rooms. Cars, bedrooms, telephone conversations, meals where someone speaks too little. Moments when an object suddenly means more than it did 5 minutes earlier. And in Diana's later accounts of her marriage, Camilla was not a distant figure who suddenly appeared at the end. She was part of the emotional landscape much earlier. That is why jewelry matters so much in Diana's story. A ring is supposed to simplify things. One person chooses another, a circle. No beginning, no end. No third point, but Diana's marriage eventually became famous precisely because, in her telling, the circle was never that simple. Years later, she would describe the marriage in one devastating image. There were 3 people inside it. But long before she said that on TV, she had reached a point where private suspicion became private confrontation. Winter, 1989. Away birthday party connected to Camilla's family. Diana is 28 years old. 8 years have passed since the cathedral. She is no longer the shy 19-year-old introduced to the world before her engagement. She is a mother of 2, one of the most photographed women alive. And yet, according to her own recorded account, she is frightened. That detail matters, because courage is often rewritten after the fact. We remember people after they become symbols and forget that, in the moment, they were human beings with shaking hands and racing thoughts. Diana did not describe herself entering that confrontation without fear. She described herself as terrified, and she went anyway. That is the real scene, not a fearless princess. A frightened woman who had decided that fear would no longer make the decision for her. Diana's account was later heard through recordings associated with biographer Andrew Morton. CBS reported that the confrontation occurred at a party in the winter of 1989, and that Diana described deliberately approaching Camilla. CBS News. Picture the architecture of the moment. A private party, people upstairs, conversation, movement. Normality. Diana sees Charles and Camilla with another guest. She makes a decision. Not tomorrow, not through an advisor, not through palace channels. Now, she indicates that she wants to speak privately with Camilla, and suddenly the atmosphere changes, because everyone in a room can pretend something is unspoken only until somebody gives it a name. Diana gives it a name. According to her recorded recollection, she tells Camilla, "I know what's going on between you and Charles. There it is. Not a question, a statement. The emotional architecture of Diana's marriage changes in that instant. Before those words, there is suspicion. After those words, there is acknowledgement. Perhaps not agreement, perhaps not confession, but acknowledgement that Diana is no longer willing to participate in the fiction of not seeing. Camilla initially denies understanding what Diana means. Diana continues. She makes clear that she believes she understands the relationship. Camilla responds by pointing to what Diana already has, public admiration, her children. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And when the story is over, come back and tell us what you thought. We'd love to hear your honest review. Now, let's get back to the story, the extraordinary attention surrounding her. And Diana's answer, according to the account preserved from her recordings, is painfully simple. I want my husband. 4 words. That is why the scene has survived. Not because Diana produced the perfect insult. She didn't. Not because she humiliated Camilla. That is not what gives the confrontation its force. It is powerful because Diana reduces years of confusion into the simplest possible demand. I want my husband, not the palace, not the photographers, not the title, not the crowds. The husband, and then comes another revealing element. Diana does not present herself as triumphant. She acknowledges that she understands she is in the way of something between Charles and Camilla, while insisting she knows what is happening and does not want to be treated as though she cannot see it. That distinction matters. She is not saying, I have won. She is saying, do not tell me reality is not real. And perhaps that is the most important emotional shift in the entire story, because the confrontation does not magically repair the marriage. It does not produce a cinematic apology. Charles does not suddenly abandon every emotional complication and rush toward Diana. Camilla does not disappear. The institution does not gather Diana into its arms and say, you were right, we should have listened. The world goes on. That is what makes it sadder. And more believable, royal bodyguard Ken Worf later described the aftermath as significant. CBS reported his recollection that the journey back was heated, but that Diana seemed to have released something she had been carrying and became more relaxed once the issue had finally been brought into the open. CBS News, think about that. The confrontation hurts, and yet afterwards something becomes lighter. Why? Because certainty can sometimes hurt less than denial. Pain has edges, confusion does not. For years, a person can survive terrible truths while being destroyed by the demand that they pretend those truths do not exist. This is where our ring belongs, not as a fabricated historical fact. As a symbol, imagine Diana returning from that party and looking at her hand. The jewelry has not changed. The marriage has. The ring still fits exactly as it did that morning. But now Diana does not see it in quite the same way, because the question is no longer, is something happening? The question becomes, what am I going to do with what I know? And that question takes years to answer. The public, meanwhile, continues watching. Royal engagements continue. Photographs continue. Diana smiles. Charles performs his duties. The machinery of monarchy moves forward because institutions are extraordinarily good at movement. Carriages depart. Planes take off. Hands are shaken. Speeches are delivered. A marriage can be collapsing privately while functioning perfectly in a photograph. That is one of the great contradictions of Diana's life. Visibility did not necessarily mean understanding. The more photographed she became, the easier it was for the public to mistake seeing her for knowing her. Then the private story starts escaping. Books, recordings, friends, journalists, briefings, counter-briefings. The marriage becomes not simply a relationship, but a battle over narrative. Who was difficult? Who was wounded? Who betrayed whom? When did the marriage truly break? When did other relationships begin? There is no responsible version of this history in which every moral question is simple. Diana herself later acknowledged having another relationship. Charles would publicly acknowledge adultery. Both were human beings inside a marriage that had deteriorated profoundly. But the dispute over chronology and responsibility mattered enormously because each side's version changed the moral meaning of what had happened. By 1992, the private collapse was no longer containable. In December of that year, the separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales was formally announced. Diana remained based at Kensington Palace while Charles continued with his own royal household arrangements. The royal family 11 years after the wedding. The fairy tale had not simply ended. It had become a national argument. But watch how the ring changes meaning again. In 1981, it means expectation. In 1989, it means contradiction. By 1992, it means history. A piece of jewelry can remain physically unchanged while every promise attached to it is rewritten. And then comes 1994. Charles sits for an extraordinary television documentary with Jonathan Dimbleby. The question everyone is waiting for eventually arrives. Had he been faithful to his wife? Charles says that he had been until the marriage had become irretrievably broken down. The wording is crucial. It acknowledges adultery while also locating it after, in Charles's account, the effective collapse of the marriage. Contemporary reporting treated the statement as a stunning public admission. PBS's retrospective transcript and contemporary reporting from Time and the Washington Post all document the significance of that answer. PBS, for Diana, however, the public acknowledgement does not erase what she believed she knew years earlier. That is why the 1989 confrontation matters. The argument is not simply about whether infidelity eventually occurred. Charles publicly acknowledged that. The deeper dispute concerns the emotional timeline. When did Diana begin to feel displaced? When did Charles and Camilla's bond become intolerable within the marriage? When did friendship become something else? When did Diana know? When did everyone else know? And when was she permitted to say it? No. That word keeps returning. She knew. She wanted them to know that she knew. Years later, the public would know too. Then November 1995 arrives. Diana sits alone before a television camera for Panorama. There is no cathedral, no balcony, no ceremonial uniform beside her. No family arranged around her. Just Diana. And a voice that has increasingly begun to speak without the protective language traditionally expected from royalty. The interviewer asks whether Camilla had been a factor in the breakdown of the marriage. Diana gives one of the most famous royal answers ever recorded. There were 3 of us in this marriage. It was short enough to become a headline, but psychologically, it reached backward through years, back toward every moment of uncertainty, every object, every unexplained absence, every conversation Diana later believed had confirmed what she feared. Back toward that winter party, back toward the frightened woman who decided to walk across a room. The Panorama interview aired on November 20, 1995, and the exchange about Camilla is preserved in PBS's archival transcript. The circumstances by which the BBC interview was obtained became the subject of serious later controversy and investigation, but Diana's statement itself entered the historical record. Panhandle PBS. Now return to our opening image. The table, Charles, Camilla, Diana, the ring. Again, not a literal scene we can establish from reliable evidence. A reconstruction, but now perhaps you understand why it works symbolically, because Diana's most important act was not taking jewelry off her hand. It was separating the symbol from the reality. The symbol said marriage. The reality said estrangement. The symbol said certainty. The reality contained doubt. The symbol said 2. Diana said 3, and once she could articulate that contradiction, the emotional power of the symbol began to weaken. The official divorce was completed on August 28, 1996. 15 years after the wedding, Diana was no longer Charles's wife, though she remained Diana, Princess of Wales, and continued to be recognized as part of the wider royal family structure. She and Charles continued sharing responsibility for William and Harry, the royal family. There is temptation when telling Diana's story to turn every scene into revenge. The confrontation, the dress, the interview, the divorce, every gesture becomes a weapon, but that interpretation is too small, because revenge requires the other person to remain the center of the story. Diana's transformation is more interesting when viewed differently. The confrontation with Camilla was not important because Diana defeated Camilla. She didn't. Charles and Camilla's story did not end that night. It continued. The confrontation mattered because Diana finally stopped allowing uncertainty to dictate her behavior. That is not victory over another woman. It is recovery of one's own voice. And the distinction changes everything. Maybe that is why the smallest detail in the story feels so powerful. Not shouting, not breaking something, not storming through a palace. A ring resting on a table, because sometimes surrendering a symbol is not surrender, sometimes it is recognition. This object represented what everyone told Diana her life was supposed to be. Princess, wife, future queen, mother of an heir, fairy tale bride, but titles cannot make a marriage intimate. Crowds cannot make a person feel chosen, palaces cannot manufacture trust, and jewelry cannot force 3 people into a story designed for 2. Diana discovered that brutally, slowly, publicly, and imperfectly. She made mistakes. Charles made mistakes. Their marriage became something none of them could control. But the woman remembered mainly for vulnerability also demonstrated something more difficult than fearlessness. She acted while afraid. In 1989, according to her own account, she was terrified of confronting Camilla. She walked toward her anyway. That is the part worth remembering. Not because it turned Diana into a saint. It didn't. Not because it made Charles or Camilla cartoon villains. History is more complicated than that. It matters because human beings sometimes spend years waiting for somebody else to confirm what their own eyes and instincts are telling them. Diana's confrontation marks the moment when confirmation becomes less important than self-belief. She does not need Camilla to agree. She needs Camilla to understand that Diana is no longer pretending not to see. And what happened next? No miracle. That is the answer nobody expects. The marriage did not suddenly heal. The triangle did not disappear. The palace did not transform. There was no perfect resolution waiting on the other side of confrontation. Instead came more years, more pain. Separation. Public confession. Diana's own TV interview, divorce. And finally, a new version of Diana who existed outside the role she had entered at 20. The ring, in our reconstructed image, remains on the table. Nobody touches it. For a moment, it belongs to no one. Then Diana stands. Not triumphant, not healed, not yet free, but different. Because when she entered that room, the ring was carrying the authority of the story everyone else had written for her. When she leaves, it is only an object, and Diana is beginning, slowly, painfully, to become the author again. Years later, people would debate almost every part of her life. Her choices, her interviews, her relationships, her vulnerabilities, her conflicts with the royal family. The arguments would outlive her, but her own voice survived too, on recordings, in interviews, in the memories of people who stood nearby when private royal history was unfolding. And perhaps that is the final meaning of the ring on the table. Not that Diana rejected love. She spent much of her life searching for it. Not that she rejected marriage. She had once desperately wanted hers to work. What she gradually rejected was the idea that maintaining the appearance of something was more important than naming what it had become. The princess who entered St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981 was surrounded by symbols. The woman who emerged from the marriage years later had learned their limits. A title could not tell her who she was. A palace could not decide what she had experienced. A newspaper could not make her feelings unreal. And a ring could not demand silence. That may be why Diana remains so emotionally powerful decades later. People do not remember only the gowns, or the jewels, or the photographs. They remember the tension between what the world saw and what she said she lived. The fairy tale and the private room. The smile and the silence. The ring and the marriage, two versions of the same life, and somewhere between them stood Diana, trying to make people understand that seeing a princess was not the same thing as hearing a woman. So imagine the room one last time. The lamp, the polished table, Charles, Camilla, Diana. And between them, one small circle of metal. For years, Diana had been trapped inside circles drawn by other people. Royal duty, public expectation, marriage, protocol, silence. But circles can be broken without breaking the object itself. Sometimes all you have to do is take the ring from your hand, place it on the table, and decide that from this moment forward, nobody gets to tell you that you did not see what you saw. That is not the story of a woman losing control. It is the story of a woman beginning to reclaim it. And if Diana's story still means something to you, remember her not only as the princess the world lost. Remember the woman who eventually insisted on speaking in her own voice, because palaces preserve portraits, archives preserve documents, but people preserve memory, and sometimes memory is the only place where a voice finally gets to finish what it was trying to say.